This is atmospheric. Goddamn winter, making it dark and intense. Alright, today we're going to be talking about The Penelopiad by Margaret Atwood. Wow. Wow. I first heard about this book on Jean's channel, and she has touted it as one of her favorite books, so pressure's on. And if you recall from my Can Month, I actually haven't read Margaret Atwood yet, and thus with this book I have rectified the Canadian sin that I had been engaged in, and now it's all good. I no longer have to be covered in maple syrup and left out in the snow. This is part of the Canongate Myth series where they do retellings of myths. Did you figure it out on your own? And this one is specifically concerning the myth of Odysseus, specifically his wife Penelope, and the curious ending of the myth wherein Odysseus hangs Penelope's 12 maids for seemingly not a big deal besides the fact that they were apparently sleeping with the enemy. So this book is all about looking at history from the neglected point of view of women, which is what I am all about. Fixed it, kind of. This video is truly a battle between light and darkness. The first thing I want to talk about is the narrative structure. So the story is being told from Penelope's point of view, but the voices of the maids are also weaved into the narrative throughout the story through like laments and songs, and then later on through a more modern context, which we'll talk about in a second. Part of the reason why I like this narrative structure so much is because of the juxtaposition. So one of the first chapters is basically about Penelope's childhood, and she's telling you about how her parents and how her mom is kind of this really like indifferent, cold woman who may or may not have left her in the sea to possibly drown. So it's this depiction of this very sad, noble childhood. And then right after that, you have the voices of the maids telling their stories and how they grew up and how they are people that are like of the earth, right? Like they're dirty, they're also dehumanized. The reason I like that juxtaposition is because it shows that there is more than one kind of suffering that, in this case, women are experiencing, and one woman's story and history isn't being privileged over another. Another thing that this book talks about really well is the role of women in war. In the context of the story, this book is taking place mostly during the Trojan War and then Odysseus's long-ass return back home. Something I discovered while reading this book is that there is a whole area of study which is feminist analysis of nationalism and war, because one of the most intense articulations of nationalism is war. And under this logic of nationalism, there is a very clear patriarchal divide between the role that women are supposed to play and the role that men are supposed to play. There's a part in the book where Penelope is kind of reminiscing about what her role is while her husband is off at war, and she kind of goes onto this tangent, and one of the things that she says is marriages were for having children, and children were not toys and pets. Children were vehicles for passing things along. These things could be kingdoms, rich wedding gifts, stories, grudges, blood feuds. Through children, alliances were forged. Through children, wrongs were avenged. To have a child was to set loose a force in the world. What this quote is really getting at is the fact that women's role for the nation under this idea of nationalism is that they are biological and cultural reproducers to create citizens for the nation. And the most common female image that gets drawn out of this role of women being mothers is the idea of the chaste and suffering mother. And something that Penelope actually talks about in her narrative is she touches on that. She touches on the idea that she has been painted in the myths and legends as being this incredibly like noble, modest, suffering mother figure. By addressing that and challenging that, she is destabilizing this entire narrative of what it is that women are supposed to do for the nation during war. Before we get to my favorite part, I do want to talk about something that I was a bit like, on. And that is the depiction of Helen of Troy. Penelope and Helen are cousins, and it kind of sets up the classic dichotomy of the modest, intelligent Penelope and then Helen as being like the beautiful, maniacal bastard. It's not that I was against the idea of Helen being an unlikable character, but the trope of the beautiful, vain, vapid bitch who just stirs shits up because she's bored and because she can is it's boring. It's boring. I am not a classicist. There may be textual evidence for this. I don't know. It's also being told from the point of view of Penelope, right? This isn't an objective narrative. It would have been more interesting if there had been a bit more dimension, because even though this is a very like short book and there's like not a lot of space for super intense character development, there is a character which was Odysseus's old nursemaid that Penelope encounters when she goes back to live in Odysseus's house, and she's not likable, but there's more to her. Like she's kind of a dick, but she does have some dimension. So now on to my favorite part. We're gonna talk about the maids' voices coming through in the modern context. One of the sections near the end of the story is where all the maids are in a present day anthropology lecture, and they are lecturing all of the male academics who have ignored them in their story all throughout academia. And they're lecturing them on the theories that have come out of feminist academia about what happened to them, including the idea that Penelope and her maids were a matriarchal moon cult and that Odysseus had to slaughter them in order to return to establish his patriarchal rule. Oh my god. What? Yes, I am here for that. The next phase in which their voices pop through was in another modern context, and it was the trial of Odysseus for having hanged the 12 maids. That whole section really brought up the narrative around ownership of women's bodies and how rape is constructed in relation to that. They call Penelope up to the stand as a witness, and one of the things that they're trying to work through in this case is whether or not the rape of the maids counted as being actual rape, right? Because the reason that Odysseus supposedly hung them was because they were like sleeping with the enemy, right? She says it wasn't the fact of their being raped that told against them. In the mind of Odysseus, it's that they were raped without permission. What this book is doing is giving voice to historical injustices against women that have been ignored. And this is the shit that gets me hype. This is what I'm here for. The last thing that I want to talk about that happened that I loved, there is a scene at the very end of the book where Penelope encounters the maids in the Acropolis. I can't remember if that's what it's called. It's the place where when you die, you go. Wow, Ileana, are you sure you're not a classicist? There's a point where the maids encounter Penelope, and even though throughout the story she's lamented about what happened to them and is so upset and feels so bad for them, she basically ends up defending Odysseus, and the maids like call her out. They're like, no, what? No. So what I love about this, which is kind of goes back to the first point I made about having the two narratives, is the fact that even though Penelope's narrative is dominant, right, it's like told from her perspective mostly, the maids still challenge hers as well. So they're still destabilizing her narrative the whole time as well, which, God bless. It's dark because I took a long ass time doing my makeup, so appreciate the highlight, please.